What lies beneath the perfectly landscaped green lawns, the carbon copy suburban tract homes, and pristine blue swimming pools of Cuesta Verde estates in Tobe Hooper's haunted house classic Poltergeist? The answer is clearly and definitively spelled out in the film itself. It is stated in dialogue and shown. There's even a superb matte painting effect shot showing what used to be there. It might as well be underlined. Real estate mogul Frank Teague takes employee and homeowner Steve Freeling out to a sprawling cemetery on a hill on the outskirts of Cuesta Verde and assures him,
"Oh, don't worry about it. After all, it's not ancient tribal burial ground, it's just people."
So if Cuesta Verde is clearly and definitively established as not being built over an American Indian burial ground, why do so many people think it is? In the film, we are told that back in 1976, the headstones of a modern cemetery were moved in order to begin development on the suburban tract homes of Cuesta Verde estates. As a cost-cutting measure, the bodies were secretly and carelessly left behind in their graves, while scores of Reagan-era SoCal yuppies with Regulation 2.5 children could settle in directly over their previously venerated resting places. Once the Freelings begin to experience the inexplicable poltergeist activity in their house, the ghosts actually teleport a bevy of displaced burial jewelry through the bilocation portal and onto the living room floor. These were personal items which were buried with some of the folks resting in the earth beneath their feet. Rings, necklaces, watches, etc. These are not pieces of Native American jewelry or furs or arrowheads or other such stereotypical bric-a-brac from a displaced indigenous tribe. These are modern items, which are pointed out by Dr. Martha Lesh as varying between being 100 years old and only a few years old. And in the chaotic finale of the film, we see skeletons in conventional modern-day coffins bursting from the ground, nary a hint of Native American iconography on display. The only mention in the film of an ancient tribal burial ground is the cynical joke Frank Teague throws at Steve in the cemetery scene. It is literally dismissed as a concern because the land is not a Native American resting place. Everyone knows they would just be asking for a curse if they did that. You've heard it in casual conversation. You've seen experts mention it in documentaries. You've read it in published articles. You've found it on reputable websites. Even the inciting incident of the 2006 Season 4 Poltergeist parody episode of Family Guy, titled Petergeist, is the unearthing and desecration of a Native American skull. So where did this horror movie Mandela effect come from? For starters, it's worth mentioning that two extremely high-profile and very successful haunted house movies, released just a couple of years prior to Poltergeist, do indeed utilize the now cliched backstory of structures built over ancient Indian burial grounds. Stuart Rosenberg's 1979 feature adaptation of Jay Anson's The Amityville Horror.
There was a tribe of Indians called the Shinnecogs, and they used this land as a sort of exposure pen. They put all the crazy people here, and they left them here to die. There are people buried here.
And Stanley Kubrick's 1980 adaptation of Stephen King's The Shining.
The site is supposed to be located on an Indian burial ground, and I believe they actually had to repel a few Indian attacks as they were building it.
Historically speaking, Jay Anson's 1977 book The Amityville Horror may very well be the actual genesis of this well-worn trope, seemingly the first instance of the haunted house built over an Indian burial ground in literature. And while the film adaptation of The Shining makes it a point to mention in passing that the Overlook Hotel was built on an Indian burial ground, King's novel does not. Later, of course, King would utilize the Indian burial ground trope for his 1983 novel Pet Sematary. Back to the Amityville Horror and The Shining. Both film adaptations are noteworthy for offering up multiple supernatural origins into their respective backstories, desecration of Native American burial grounds, mysterious deaths and horrible murders, and recurring instances of homicidal psychosis, seemingly brought on by the structures which may themselves be inherently evil. Poltergeist doesn't have nearly as many possible explanations for its haunting, though it does have its fair share. We are told in the film that the Freelings were the first family to move into the neighborhood several years before the film begins, and Carol Ann was actually born in the house itself. This explains why the Freelings are seemingly the only residents being targeted in the neighborhood, and why the restless spirits are so intent on abducting or possessing Carol Ann. And other than Steve Freeling's plans to break ground on an in-ground swimming pool that upcoming week, the standard why now storytelling question, usually asked by Hollywood development executives, doesn't really have a clear answer. Carol Ann just starts talking to the TV one night, and it's shown as being new, unusual behavior from the 5-year-old, not something anyone in the house has seen her do before. And as far as we, the audience, know, the Freeling house doesn't appear to be truly haunted until the ghosts beam into the walls through the television screen. The spirits don't seem to have any true agency until psychically sensitive Carol Ann communes with them.
They're here.
Carol Ann's iconic line is a declaration that the spirits have, as of that moment, officially arrived in the house. Other than the allegorical subtext that people can't ever really know what kind of influences television might be inviting into their homes, the only explanation given as to why the TV is the entry point for the ghosts is a theory voiced by paranormal investigator Ryan. He posits that an analog TV channel not receiving a broadcast and set to white noise might pick up frequencies and audio signals from any number of sources, even the great beyond. Perhaps folks just ascribed the same Indian burial ground backstory to Poltergeist because of the inherent similarities in all three stories. After all, both The Shining and Poltergeist share many elements with the Amityville horror. Dad gets a little too fond of his axe after moving into a haunted dwelling which begins to slowly drive him insane. Family is plagued by intensifying paranormal activity before discovering that their house contains a portal to the other side. Adding in the layer that the buildings in all three films have been built over some sort of resting place of the dead may have just caused a collective blanket assumption. A novelization was hastily written by James Caan. The book made it onto shelves in time to capitalize on the theatrical release of the film. While the book takes some interesting creative detours, it never once brings up the notion that Cuesta Verde was built on the same land as an American Indian burial ground.
They're back.
Poltergeist was followed by two sequels, Poltergeist 2: The Other Side, released in 1986, and 1988's Poltergeist 3. Both films stick with members of the Freeling family and diminutive psychic Tangina Barons to varying degrees. But Poltergeist 2 does a couple of interesting things with retroactive continuity that might actually help to explain the native Indian burial ground Mandela effect. So let's get this out of the way right off the bat. Yes, Poltergeist 2 introduces a Native American mystic character. And yes, there is mention of a supposed massacre involving Indians. How both of those things end up impacting the first film is curious and potentially relevant. Poltergeist 2 was released 4 years after the first film. There is an active archaeological dig going on at the empty lot where the house once stood, under the hole originally dug for the swimming pool. Tangina and her excavators have unearthed a cavern full of skeletal bodies beneath the modern-day cemetery. This subterranean void is investigated in the opening scene by Taylor, played by Will Sampson, a stereotypical mystic Native American medicine man and occult expert. Later in the film, we learn that it is the spirits of these corpses that were actually making all the trouble in the Freeling house in 1982. This fundamentally changes the original Poltergeist intrusion, making it more about the house's direct proximity to these specific dead people and less about the Freelings' symbolic role in Cuesta Verde's establishment as a community. This questionable retcon is definitely a sticking point for some viewers, but it did give birth to the spectral religious zealot character of Reverend Henry Kane, played with terrifying relish by the late Julian Beck. Kane is identified in Poltergeist 2 as literally being the beast incarnate, retroactively establishing that he was the evil adversary the Freelings faced in the first film.
He comes in many forms, but that was him.
And while this humanizing of the malevolent demonic entity would seem to diminish the raw, unknowable demonic power of what we were shown in the first film, there's no denying that Julian Beck's Kane is one of the best things about the sequel, a memorable horror villain for the ages. It is very important to mention that one thing Reverend Kane is not is Native American. We see flashbacks to Kane and his followers in the desert in the 1800s, sealing themselves in the cavern after he prophesizes that the end of the world is coming. Tangina tells Diane that Kane's flock mysteriously disappeared and were supposedly massacred by Indians. But we quickly learn that that piece of assumptive history is not true. This whole group of misguided cultists died a slow, horrible death because Kane told them they had to wait out the apocalypse in this hole in the ground. Once again, no Native American burial ground. We have a heroic Native American character in Taylor, but he is not a ghost, and he's specifically using Native American mysticism to try and help the Freelings through their second encounter with the Cuesta Verde specters, none of whom are Native American. It is made abundantly clear that the indigenous are mystical protectors in this saga.
Apparently, she actually convinced an entire neighborhood that it was haunted.
You think she's able to create some sort of mass hysteria?
No, not really. It's more like mass hypnosis.
1988's Poltergeist 3 sticks with the continuity established in the second film, recasting the late Julian Beck with a makeup-assisted lookalike. He's got an entirely new MO involving mirrors, but he's the same guy with the same plan, which is evidently just to get Carol Ann Freeling at all costs. And since Poltergeist 3 is set in a Chicago skyscraper, there is little to no new backstory mentioned about the land at Cuesta Verde. Even the 2015 remake makes a joke out of it, paraphrasing Mr. Teague's dialogue from the first film, while a dinner party of upper-class folks pleasantly mock the reboot's version of the financially struggling Freeling family, now called the Bowens, for having bought a house in what is obviously a haunted neighborhood, now called Willow Point.
Wow, it's not like it was an ancient tribal burial ground.
We can never truly know what caused this pop-cultural mass delusion, a low-grade horror movie Mandela effect. It's fascinating to have such a widespread misconception continue to spread and propagate in the age of the internet and film analysis and streaming media, but here we are. Did folks really just presume that the backstory used in the Amityville Horror and The Shining carried over into another haunted house film? Was it further compounded by the introduction of Taylor and Native American mysticism in Poltergeist 2? Was it all because of Family Guy? Maybe someday, when we're all dead and they relocate the cemetery we're buried in, we'll finally understand. Until then, remember, it's not ancient tribal burial ground. It's just people.